Ram is the founder of Sherpalo Ventures, and he certainly knows how to pick winning companies. In 1994, he joined Netscape, the company that really defined the web at the time. Netscape was pre-revenue, pre-product, and pre-IPO. In 1998, he joined Jeff Bezos and team over at Amazon. And then in 2000, Ram started his current firm, Sherpalo, and again picked a very interesting company when he met the founders of Google and became one of the early investors and the founding board member. And he's, of course, still on the board today. Ram is the person who will tell you his story and give you his thoughts on the industry now. Thank you for being here with us.
So thank you, Burkhart, and thank you to Professor Iklak for having me here today. Just hearing the 3 or 4 of you at the beginning talk about different events on campus makes me vicariously want to come back and live the life of a student again. It seems more exciting than the real world, especially today where the market dropped another 600 points. So what I was asked to do before I go to a presentation, and I hate doing PowerPoints, but we will do a short one just to give you a sense of one snapshot of the market, because you may or may not all be interested in that topic. What the professor asked me to do was to talk a little bit about my own sort of life story and how I ended up where I did. So I went to school in Madras, India for my undergrad, and then came to Michigan. Like many of you here in the Haas School or many of you undergrads, I did a business degree after that, undergrad in math. And then I ended up working. I applied heavily in the mid-'70s when I went into the workforce. There was the first big oil crisis. None of you will remember, but your parents will remember. And it was pretty hard on Detroit, which is, Ann Arbor is where I was. So I had applied for a systems analyst job in a number of these auto companies. And as luck would have it, none of them were hiring. So I ended up in a early distributed data processing company that was using Zilog Z80. It's a company that doesn't exist today, but it's in a museum somewhere here. But I ended up as a systems analyst in a little software company. So I stumbled into software. So a lot of career planning is stumbling into the right successes with a little bit of smarts. So, luck favors the prepared mind. So do be prepared, but also hope to be lucky at the same time. So I ended up there and then worked through the early years in a young company because I didn't want to commute too far. And you get comfortable in your own university town. You don't want to go too far. You probably want to, I don't know, how many of you here want to leave the Bay Area and go to the East Coast or somewhere else to work? Show of hands. Oh, that's a lot. How many of you want to go to New York and be on Wall Street? 0, as I would have expected, at least today. But I think, a lot of people go to different parts of the country, but I chose to stay in the same place initially, and I picked the company based on the shortest commute and where I could find a job. It was that simple. So there was no profound theory of, should I go here or should I go there? It later on dawned on me that it turned out to be the right sector. Software in the 70s was just starting. I mean, people were still building either the VAX, the PDP-11. Those were the computers of its time, just coming on. Digital was starting to give IBM competition to the mainframes. So this was the era. And the little applications that were developed were either batch processing or distributed data processing applications. I got to work on those. Then I moved. Worked internationally in Europe for a couple of years. Again, another company bought this little company that I worked for. So I saw how a merger and an acquisition works, and it's horrible. I mean, they basically, a big company takes you over and they impose their culture. And this was still in the old days when companies were less sensitive to people and they were managed like herds, basically. So it was quite interesting. But it was a great experience. Then I came back and I lived in Minneapolis, and they used to fly me to the West Coast every few weeks. So the winters in Minneapolis were pretty tough. So every time I would come to the West Coast, I'd say, how do I find a job here? So that's how I ended up in the Valley in 1983. And I was presenting at a telecommunication conference in San Diego for Nortel. Bell Northern Research Nortel, which is, again, a shadow of its former self, but was a big company in those days back in the early 80s. And somebody came up to me and said, I'm with a startup. Here's my business card. Would you like to come work for us in the local area networking business? Well, again, I stumbled into a sector that was to be hot because the PCs were just coming out. And the next stage of it was to network and communicate with each other. So I worked in a young company called Cytec that was later bought. And they created the early version of NetBIOS, which was licensed to Microsoft when they were just a bunch of 20, 30, 40 people in Seattle. It was a really young company. And so I just saw the whole birth of the whole PC industry from that vantage point. Then came another downturn. So in your life, you will go through many business cycles. And part of the trick is to make sure that as you go through that and as you begin to become a person with a family and with kids and everything else, you have to, it's sort of like surfing through waves. You have to make sure you don't fall off your surfboard as you go through this process. So then I ended up at another company in sort of the whole space of X Windows. So Unix, if you remember, was hot in the 80s. So I ended up in the Unix field sort of almost by happenstance again, because I happened to know someone that was in the networking industry that started a young company in the X Windows space, worked there for a few years. Then I saw Netscape. And the beauty of it is the Unix people saw Netscape earlier than the people that were running Windows, because there was not a Windows version in the early days of that product because it was developed at the University of Illinois in Urbana. So I saw the press release and I just sent an email in saying, hey, I know what a browser is. We've been developing one in this little company. So, and the guy said, look, if you can spell browser, come on in and we'll interview you. So it was that time. And the guy that interviewed me was no other than Jim Clark, professor of computer science at Stanford, and then later started Silicon Graphics, and then left Silicon Graphics as founder to go start Netscape. And what did he do? He went to the University of Illinois and he decided to hire 6 programmers from their supercomputing lab to start the company. So they were making $6 an hour. He stayed at the Days Inn, interviewed all of them, and he said, look, I don't know whether you graduate or not. I don't really care. But if you are willing to come to the West Coast, I'll pay you $10 an hour. Literally, this is the story of the early days of Netscape. So that's how he started the company. And lo and behold, 4 months later, they invented downloading software. So till then, software was not downloaded. Today, you would be in disbelief if I told you that software is shipped on disks or on CD-ROMs or other devices. Today, everything you do, including all the wonderful stuff from the Apple iPhone App Store, everything else is all downloaded. But back then it was not, because IP networks were not pervasive. So Netscape was the first company to invent downloading software because the size of the software was small enough for the browser. Small enough is a relative term. It was still over a megabyte in the first version of the product, and over a period of time, it ballooned to 6 or 7 meg. So the download started to get bigger and bigger. But downloading the software allowed them to have an instant presence on literally tens of millions of desktops around the world. And that was an innovation, because for them to market themselves any other way would have been very hard. And they also made it free. So the notion of free software was beginning. There was always a small open source industry, but they were sort of like, liberals, if you will, in a world of everybody wanting to make money on everything they ever created. And so this turned out to be an early innovation. And then I lived through the whole process of seeing that company grow and then go down, how they faced competition, the mistakes they made, the kind of heavy artillery attack they were under from Microsoft. All of that was wonderful learning. So the moral of the story up to that point is you learn lots of great things at school, you make lots of really good friends, and then you go into the real world. Your next degree starts. You haven't graduated yet till you continue to learn more and more. And as long as you listen well and you go through lots of experiences in the real world, you continue to learn. So to this day, I continue to learn. One of the things I've never learned yet is how do you always recruit great people? It's a big challenge. So anyway, Netscape was one part of the story. Then I went off to start a young company in comparison shopping. I just met some folks from the winners of the Venture Lab companies. And I saw the level of competition that takes place to pick 4 or 5 winners. It's very intense. It is the real world, and that's how it is going to be. You may get funded, but funding does not equal success. So you're going to see that later in life as you go through your own entrepreneurial experiences. But so I went off and said, I want to start a comparison shopping company, because back then in the early days of the web, and Netscape was sort of like Fairchild Semiconductor was in the early days of the chip industry, where you were the only company and you got an interesting vantage point to see what was going on all around you. And that's how Intel was born and National Semi was born, and the many other companies that followed. The same way Netscape was the harbinger of all of the companies that grew out of that whole internet ecosystem. And so comparison shopping turned out to be an interesting market, because only books, music, and video were being sold back in 1998. Today, you wouldn't think that, because there's so many products being sold. And there was not enough comparison of prices across different websites. So we said, well, let's start this and see how it goes. And all it took is working with a little database, and you could get MySQL for free, and you could, of course, you didn't have either Google's App Engine or Amazon's S3 EC2 infrastructure to operate for free. So you had to still set up your own data center and your own bandwidth and everything to do that. But we started it. We were lucky. We were early. We did well. And Amazon bought us. So we ended up inside Amazon when they were still very, very, very young. So I ended up being one of the oldest members on Jeff's staff. It was all 30-something, and I was a 40-year-old guy at that time. And it was kind of interesting. So Jeff said, build, build, build. So we ended up raising more money than the national debt of Brazil at the peak of the bubble. And as all good things, that came to an end. And Amazon survived the bust because capital was free, and they were able to sort of regroup. Even though they had made a lot of mistakes, they were able to regroup and live to fight another day. And that's why today they're still there, and they're a good company for the reason that they had already built a level of sort of steam, and they were able to propel themselves forward when the downturn ended, and they were the only last man left standing in e-commerce. Other than eBay, but eBay was in a different business at the time, and now the two, of course, are literally overlapping in each other's territories, but it wasn't true then. So then I came back because Seattle was too rainy for me. So this is how, you get lucky, right? So I said, Jeff, I'm not going to be in Seattle. My family doesn't want to move. We've lived in the Bay Area for 20 years. I like the sun, etc. And by the way, Seattle's a great place to live if you like quality of life, less traffic, and good schools, and nice communities. But for the weather. So I came back, and I went to Stanford to see a professor, and he said, hey, I have this interesting project you should look at. So I went and looked at it. The two guys were Larry and Sergey, and they didn't have a company yet. So I said, well, it's kind of interesting, but I don't think I'm going to invest in this. Why don't I introduce you? I know everybody in the business, so I'll introduce you to Yahoo. I'll introduce you to InfoSeek. I'll introduce you to the other guys here who were on the West Coast, who were InfoSeek. No, not InfoSeek. InfoSeek, Inktomi, huh? Ask Jeeves, somebody who was here in Berkeley. That was what I was thinking, Ask Jeeves. And go talk to all of them. The only one I didn't know was Lycos, because they were a Carnegie Mellon project, and I didn't know those guys. So they talked to them, and then I never heard from them for 3 or 4 months. Then 4 months later, I get an email. By this time, I'm really busy, working now for Bezos, and I'm in Seattle. I said, well, I come every weekend to see my family, so I'll come see you guys, or you come see me. So they came over and saw me and said, so what do you want to talk about? I said, well, we want to tell you the results of our conversations. I said, okay. So they went through, and the one thing that struck me was when they met the Yahoo founders, they said, well, this is all neat and interesting, and it's an order of magnitude better in terms of relevance, but we're already a public company, and we're not going to cut our page views by half in order to do this. This doesn't make sense for us. So that was the aha moment where I said, interesting. Even though search is a mature market, maybe consumers want relevance more than they want all these results that go up to kazoo and lots of clutter on the homepage, etc. So I still wasn't clear this was nothing profound. I wasn't clear what size company could be built, but I said, let me take a small flyer on the company and see where it goes. These are two obviously very smart guys, but I don't think it's still necessarily a big market, but let me see. So that's how the initial first checks were written, and then they moved to a garage on Willow Street in Menlo Park, and they lived there for the next year, and they were 3 engineers, 3 PhDs, and then we hired 5 more engineers, no biz dev people, nobody else, just engineers. They continued to work. Of course, inside the Stanford network, they had traffic, and then they were on a bunch of the .edu networks around the country, and so word spread, word of mouth. Stanford kicked them out of their network saying, look, you're clogging up a lot of traffic, so get out. And we did the licensing with Stanford Technology Licensing, got out, and still didn't really fund the company with a lot of money. So the moral of that story is, they were early in that this type of quantum innovation in a mature market caused them to be able to destabilize what would otherwise be viewed as a mature segment. So this was new because normally the conventional wisdom is you don't go into mature markets because there's no opportunity there. Well, one thing about mature markets. People buy products in mature markets. You don't have to go create a new market. The question is, can you displace the incumbents? And of course, the larger the incumbent, the more threatening the incumbent, the amount of capital investment you need, all those things become barriers to entry in a segment like that. But at that time, everybody in that segment was otherwise distracted. They were all trying to become media companies. And they had forgotten that search and email, to this day, are the 2 most used applications on the internet. How much of your time do you spend on search and email? Let's by a show of hands, somebody that spends 80% of your application is search. And when I say email, I include instant messenger and any other form of communication. If you're using Skype or whatever else, some other productivity thing that you're doing collaboratively is also part of that. How many of you spend 80% of your time on those 2 applications, search and email communications? So it's almost 90% of the room. So the only other things you do are sort of the old productivity apps, and we'll talk about that when we talk about all the applications moving to the cloud. Even that is going to go away. The last 10% where you're using your PowerPoint like I'm using here, or your desktop apps and so forth, everything will move to the cloud. But that is the opportunity that everyone missed by trying to become big media companies and big content companies. So Google had a huge opportunity in front of them that sort of they stumbled into by accident, but they helped themselves by executing well. In other words, the product was really good. They didn't spend a dime on marketing, on advertising, or even though their whole business was about advertising, they themselves don't advertise. The other thing is they hired really well. A players hire other A players. So when you build your teams, certainly you want people that are your best friends and who are your closest colleagues, but hire for skill and competence over loyalty and friendship. You want skill and competence. You do want loyalty and friendship, but you want skill and competence ahead of that. And so they hired really well, and so they continued to be able to build a business that could scale. They also ended up in a market where the competitors woke up 2 or 3 years later, but by then they had built enough distance and enough lead. And as you grow bigger and bigger, the lead is not just about technology. It's also about other barriers to entry, the size of the data centers, the size and scale of performance that they could apply, the backhaul networks that Google built, the ability to be global across so many languages in so many countries. All those things made a difference to them to be able to have it. The size of their index, which is larger than any other index that anybody else had, including that of Microsoft, and so on and so forth. So now, a Google-sized success is an outlier. Most of us in our lifetimes may not be able to build a company that size. Every 10 years, you're going to find a Google kind of company develop. In the 80s, you had Cisco. In the 90s, you sort of had Microsoft. in the 2000 to 2010 time frame. You had Google, and maybe you'll have another new set of companies. The next $100 billion company is being built in a garage somewhere today through this downturn, which may last the next 2 years. So this is a great time to be an entrepreneur if you build with the right team, you're capital efficient, and your time to market and time to liquidity is not too long. So that gives you sort of a view of my career and how I ended up where I did. And in the last 10 years, I've been a sort of a mentor capitalist. I wouldn't say a venture capitalist. I looked at every venture capital firm in the Valley, and I said, should I go join one of them? And I said, you know, I've been an entrepreneur all my life. I've actually been in an operating role for a long part of my life. I have a different value to add than that of an investor. And while money is one of the values that somebody adds for a young, new team and an entrepreneur, there's a lot of other values that I can add besides the money. So why not me distinguish myself even in that? So I sort of ended up being a differentiated product in an otherwise crowded and clubby industry. So it's a very unlikely success story in that context, because now I'm leveraging what I know to help lots of entrepreneurs across industries that I'm familiar with, which are largely in technology. They're not in biotech, and they're not in clean tech, although I am interested in clean tech as a segment that I will learn about, and I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities there. But this is sort of how the progression of my career ended up with me where I am today. So with that, we could do this two ways. And again, I'm going to let you guys decide. I could go to this presentation and take 20 minutes and go through it quickly. And it gives you, it frames a view of where the market is going with respect to computing, the next phase of it. Or we could go straight to questions, and we could do more questions and less content. What would you prefer? Those that prefer to hear the presentation and then save, and then there's the debate. I don't know how many of you, I don't want to be between you and the presidential debates. So we have 30 minutes left, so I could take 20 minutes and do 10 minutes of questions, or we could do 20 minutes of questions and I could flip through this really quickly to the end. What would you prefer? Let's start.
I just want to say that I'll repeat the debate at 9 p.m. on CNN.
Oh, good. So everybody should stay for this, because he just has some fresh information about when the debate gets repeated. So then we should go through this first?
No, I think ask them.
So those that want to see the presentation first. Okay, so then let's just stick with this. So I'm going to move to this end so I can navigate here a little easily. So 1 billion people are on the internet, maybe 1.25 billion almost by the time this may be a little dated, because this was done a couple of months ago. And the 550 million new people that are on are mostly in these countries: Russia, India, South Africa, Brazil, and so forth. And these are the most popular search terms in these countries. So okay, so the internet was off to a slow start at the beginning, but it's off to rapid growth. And you can see the growth trajectory. Now, most of the recent growth, so if you focus on the right end of this chart, most of it is happening in user-generated content. So what's happening is it's blogs, it's social networks, and it's YouTube. YouTube has probably greater reach today than any of the more traditional networks, whether it's CNN or Fox or any of those guys, because the viewership on the internet, on YouTube is, how many of you at night spend at least 20 minutes watching YouTube? Whether it's SNL, the episode you missed, or the short segment on the jokes on the presidential. I'm going to stay neutral on this, although I'm tempted to get into this. But how many of you watch at least 20 minutes of YouTube a day? Show of hands. Oh, it's smaller than that. Means Berkeley makes you work hard on your academics. It's less than I thought. Well, if I ask a high school audience, it's a much higher number. This is good. I'm glad you guys are working on, because this is pure entertainment. This is pure entertainment. and it's user-generated entertainment, and then there's now, of course, more branded entertainment in the form of Hulu and others. So most of the growth on the pages on the web are happening in the user-generated area of content. So this whole sort of ecosystem, I think, came about with sort of 3 revolutions and 1 evolution is the way I'd like to think of it. Google was the evolution where they combined everything, and it's really a combination of all the open source technologies out there, built to scale and built to reliability and built with a very pleasing user interface and great execution on a global scale. So that's why you have this sort of company able to take everything. So they don't pay a single dollar of royalty to any third party to run this massive global data center that serves up all these pages and pages of information to you. So their cost of delivery, besides bandwidth costs, storage costs, hardware costs, and all those, and the people costs for programming and so forth, their cost to delivery is all those things, but not cost to pay software to somebody else. Software cost like for database or something else, operating system, etc. The consumer revolution. I think everybody is now information hungry, and you almost expect to. How many of you in the room even goes to a physical newspaper during the day? A few. So I'd say 75-25 probably. 75% of you probably read it online. And I think that's the trend, and that's that's one element of the consumer revolution. The other element is, of course, commerce. Yet another element is staying connected with all your friends and relatives and so forth that way. The advertising revolution allowed people to find a business model that would pay for it. And it's a business model that's large. I mean, if Google is a $20 billion company this year, the gross dollars that it represents, and that's one company with this, let's say 70% of the market, the other 30%, maybe another 7 or 8 billion. So let's say it's a $30 billion market. The gross dollars that it represents of money being shipped around the internet with lots of small businesses involved in this who are getting paid, or others paying them and they're paying Google, however model it works in, is probably close to $100 billion. That's why this is huge, and it's growing. So the technology drivers have been broadband penetration, the falling cost of digital storage, and the democratization of production is basically open source stuff that I talked about earlier. Broadband penetration, in countries like Korea, kids are able to do their homework on their cell phones on their way back from school, on their commute on the train. Or they watch their baseball games. The office workers watch their baseball games while they're on their way home, because broadband video is streamed to cell phones. So we are behind in the broadband revolution. The falling cost of digital storage is benefiting everybody, because if you look at YouTube, their big cost is bandwidth cost, not the cost of storage, even though they're essentially they're generating in 10 minutes the equivalent of a week's worth of television content uploaded to them every 10 minutes. So the publishing revolution, which is Facebook, MySpace, YouTube, and then of course earlier the e-commerce phase, and then the information phase, which was the first part of it. Oh, let me go back. So tomorrow's consumers, and that's you guys in the room, and the kids of the generation behind you, they're global since birth. They don't know anything different. And why are they global since birth? They're accessing the entire internet, and that is their textbook. It is for most of you, because I think Berkeley puts most classes up on the internet, right? They're all streamed.
I don't know if they were all streamed, but there is some agreement that everything we take is actually made public.
Yeah. So somebody that didn't go to Berkeley or couldn't afford to come here or wasn't admitted here and lives in a different part of the world could access a lot of this content. So the democratization of information and knowledge is so valuable around the world. So for starting with young kids, and this is what the Nicholas Negroponte MIT project was all about trying to take these little laptops where it's only a browsing laptop and take it to kids. So I think you're going to see the PC replaced by a simple browsing device. The closest version of that, how many of you own a MacBook Air? There's one or two in the room. It's not, you know, and I think there will be Dell versions of it that are probably going to be even cheaper. They won't be as elegant as the Mac, but you're going to see products that are going to be fairly thin, that don't have a lot of external connectivity except wireless access. And most of what you need to do in a typical day, you could do with a device like that. And it's going to be the future. Well, we talked about this. So we went from big mainframes, light clients, all the way to big servers and the cloud. And in between, we had big servers, big clients, which is the period when you had the mini computers, and then you had the Sun machines and the Silicon Graphics machines and so forth. So that period was sort of from the mid-'80s to the, I'd say, almost to the mid-'90s, or from early '80s to mid-'90s. After that, we've gone to big servers in the cloud, many clients. But this is not time sharing as it was in the '70s, where people were using the big IBM mainframes with 3270 devices or ASCII devices. Content, the rate of growth of content is just incredible. Most of this content is, as I said earlier, user-generated. So the next phase of this is accessing information anywhere, anytime, any place on any device. And the big change you can see from 1966, when we were using 8-track tape, there was some broadcast radio, broadcast TV. The big changes in the '80s were the desktop computer, the VCR, the Walkman, for those of you that remember. I was a jogger. I remember that. And then cable TV was big. HBO came about in the '80s. And here we are in 2006. What are we talking about? Webcam, mobile internet, video game consoles, the Slingbox, TiVo-It, satellite radio, etc. So big difference in terms of access. So the best way to describe this computing cloud is photography. You would take film into your local photo store to get it processed, and you'd get physical, photos and take it back, and that's how you'd share it. Today, you're basically in this world, and that continues to evolve because most of you store it locally on your PC or on your server at home. And then some of you can upload it onto different sharing sites that are out there, and then the rest of the family can experience the birth of a new child or a wedding or some party that just happened that was put up on Facebook, and everyone's sharing pictures. By early in the morning, everyone knows what happened that missed the party. So that is, basically you're living a portion of your life online thanks to this notion of everything in the cloud. So the mobile web is going to change that. As you see and evolve over the next few years, you're going to use more and more of this on your phones. You probably already are. There's actually more like 2.5, 3 billion cell phones now worldwide, so it's 3 or 4 times the number of computers that are out there, and it's a lot cheaper. So the unduplicated audience is 136 million people out there today, just within the available audience of, and this isn't just in the developed world, where you could see that the mobile internet penetration by country here shows the big developing countries, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., are still low, but they're going to actually grow faster than the US or the Western countries, including Japan. Today, the leaders in terms of mobile web are really Japan, Korea, and Scandinavia. So only 4% of the mobile internet users are on the iPhone, but they access 5x the average on any other phone. And the reason is simply the browser interface is so much better, the usability is so much better, and they can actually, do their email or their surfing right on their iPhone. So as these devices get better and bandwidth gets better, you can see why this would naturally gravitate to the internet. I mean, naturally gravitate to the mobile phone. Now, the future of computing. Now, this is sort of more serious stuff. So I'm going to go through this with the idea that you're going to absorb what you want and discard what you don't. The future here is there's a balance between data-rich servers and smart connected applications. And that's what you're seeing sort of battle itself out, literally in terms of these new applications. Lots of universities, for example, now have shifted to running their entire network on Google Apps because they essentially offer the same thing that you get with, say, Microsoft Office, where you don't pay an individual tax. The whole applications, the entire set of applications are always available, they're always on, and they're free. Devices that sync directly with the cloud. The job of configuring, managing the devices should be brain dead simple. You don't spend a lot of time having to manage iTunes on your iPhone. It's sort of simple. It's easy. You don't even have to think about it. That's the way it's going to be for applications in the future. And every web application needs to be designed as if it's software above the level of a single device. Because in the old days, people designed software for a platform. They designed it for Windows, or they designed it for the Mac, or they designed it for Unix. Well, now you're going to design it for the web as the platform. And it's not designed for an iPhone or not designed for a Mac, that kind of thing. It's designed for a browser across the board. Let the device do what it does best. And so Amazon Kindle is an example of a device that was designed for, it doesn't do as good a job surfing the internet today, but it does do a good job if you're going to consume a lot of books on a vacation. You don't want to carry 7 books if you're a voracious reader on a vacation. Then you just put it on a Kindle and take it with you, and it costs $300, and the books themselves cost $7 versus $20. Each user controls their data in the cloud, so this is also true. So that the data should be in your control, not in the control of the company that you're doing business with. So data portability will become very important. Privacy, of course, is another hot topic as this happens. Security is another hot topic. Let me go back. So what are the core competencies in this new world? Services, not packaged software. So Salesforce, Google Apps, NetSuite, those are the examples. It's an architecture of participation where the product gets better because of user feedback. So the users help the whole process. The data can be linked and shared easily. It's cost effective and scalable. So I know there were a few people today that we met that developed their applications on Amazon EC2 or on Google App Engine or the other products that are out there. Well, they don't charge you for actually hosting your application and testing it out on there. It's free. And that's a wonderful thing. So remixable data sources and data transformation is another piece of this. Harnessing the collective intelligence of the audience. There's a website called Predictify that is, for example, popular right now because of the elections, because they're able to say in the 5 swing states how are voters going to vote. So you can go listen to CNN, but you can hear the voice of the wisdom of the crowd right in a website format where people are asking questions and literally, answers are being tabulated. Is it better than Nielsen's ratings? Probably. Is it better than getting mainstream media? Probably not, but it's evolving. And that's the beauty of this. The value of the cloud is directly proportional to the scale, speed, and the dynamism of the data. In other words, if the data is stale, it's less interesting. If the data is constantly changing and growing and is deeper, it's more valuable. So the value of the cloud is as valuable as the depth and value and the dimension of the data that's in it. Just like the whole Intel Inside in the PC world, it's the data inside is what the new mantra is. So native web applications, never sold or packaged, but offered as a service. I think those companies will succeed more. Those with a legacy model will have a hard time transforming themselves to this new model, so whole new companies will be born. No scheduled software releases, just continuous improvement. That's the model of development. No licensing, just usage. No porting. I mentioned that before. The network effects from user contributions, I mentioned that as well. Users are core developers in this model, and the data being the Intel Inside. And there are many, many examples. Craigslist, Placial, I just mentioned Predictify, and so on. And many mashups all the mashups you see on Google Maps, for example, are a wonderful example of that. Now, the race is on now as we speak, as you guys enter the workforce as entrepreneurs in your own right, or you work in young companies as you graduate, to own classes of data: location, identity, calendaring, etc. For example, the location-based apps that will evolve on the smartphones of the future, whether it's Android, Google Android-based or iPhone-based, those are going to be quite interesting, because you could enter a restaurant and you'll know which friend of yours is there. And they could turn their location finder on or off. If they don't want to be found by you, then you turn it off. So that's an example of that. The company to reach critical mass of data is usually the winner. So PayPal and YouTube were examples of that. So the winner-take-all model will continue because of that. Operations will become a core competency. So it's not about good ideas alone. It's about great execution. Dynamic scripting languages, Python, Ruby on Rails. Of course, some of these had issues with scaling, but they're getting better thanks to heavy use on certain of these websites. The rich user experience is driving more usage, and the notion of a perpetual beta is actually accepted by the user. So they're much more forgiving of continuous changes in the product. And the PC will become the device driver that runs these native rich apps. So you're going to get a dumbed down, which is why Intel is moving to a model where they have these low-end processors that they want to sell for literally a very low price. So they may end up getting shipped without a large hard drive, maybe just a flash drive or some sort of hard drive that's not, doesn't have a lot of moving parts in it, and a lot of memory, and a fast processor that can process screen images and web content, but not necessarily have to do any local computing tasks. And then you've got the whole notion of the web apps that in time will eclipse all these monolithic software models and essentially deconstruct the existing desktop productivity model with this new model that is already beginning to happen. It will take 5 to 10 years for this to fully play itself out. And in this, there will be plenty of opportunity for a whole new set of players, new set of companies and winners that will come about. So, last slide. So we're at the Web 2.0 phase, sort of the semantic web. You're beginning to hear about the semantic web and the fact that you should be able to put any question into your search engine and you should get the answer that you were hoping for and then that you were thinking for. So it should be an extension of your brain, as it were. And then, of course, the web as the OS, which is also happening. So the two are sort of colliding and becoming one big opportunity. And then the intelligent web, where you can send out personal agents to go gather data for you and come back. So it'll do a lot of tasks for you during the day. And that's sort of the esoteric future that we hope will be there. So with that, I will end this sort of formal presentation. And I'd love to take questions in the remaining time. So through a show of hands, let's start with you.
You talked about the cloud computing taking over, but you also talked about security concerns and certain...
Yeah, security, privacy, and data portability.
And it's a lot of proprietary information. There's a lot of value to that information. So how do you see it playing out between people that are kind of want one source for all the cloud data versus the companies that kind of want to control parts of that cloud?
Yeah, I think the companies that attempt to control it will ultimately fail. Because if you look at the prior generation of the web, you had AOL that built a walled garden. So I remember I was there for this whole phase, and I had a sort of a ringside seat. I had a vantage point from where I could see it. So when they first started, they were paying Time Magazine because they had a small audience, and they had to essentially go get content. And they were paying all the content players money to essentially make their content available inside AOL so they could continue to build an audience. That worked. Then later on, there was an inflection point where they had so many users, they said, look, you content provider, you will produce the product in my particular proprietary format, which was called Rain Man. Facebook has their own proprietary format, so think of them as the walled garden of today. So I think that whole process, the internet is just too powerful for one company to control it. It won't happen. It's been tried before, and it'll be tried again. But the reason those companies try is because there's so much money and there's so much desire to, be big and powerful and control it, but it won't happen. Because it'll get deconstructed every time they try because of the fact that it's all open source based. And Microsoft ruled the world for so long, so powerfully, and continues to in many ways because the underlying operating system, till this becomes sort of a thin client based, the operating system itself becomes irrelevant. They'll continue to have some level of control. But the reason they had it for so long so good was because they control the entire vertical stack. Nobody on the internet does. Question in the back.
You were talking a lot about the semantic web and the web of data and things like that coming up. And it seems that in the past few years, Google has sort of stayed away from that area and did not really put much faith in RDF and SAL and all those sort of technologies. Is that changing in Google now?
No, I'm not giving you a Google-specific view. I'm just giving you my view on this. I think Google's view is it's much harder to do the artificial language semantic web RDF-based stuff, and the research is not far enough along, even inside Google, that they're not believing that it's going to be anytime soon. They actually think really the web as an OS is probably more likely to happen than a semantic web. But I think there's a mixed view on this. I still think there's value. If you ultimately want to move towards sort of a really intelligent web, you're going to need some level of semantics that work effectively. And maybe it's not RDF, maybe it'll be some other technology that gets, but there's some, besides, I think some of the great research on this will come from the universities. I don't think it's going to come from a commercial company that has to live in the harsh world of, especially of today's Wall Street. Yeah, question here.
I was recently reading Wired magazine, and I saw that you were on the 15 smart people to advise the next president. And you were talking
on
about
white spaces,
yeah, on I guess the bandwidth spectrum and so on and so forth. What do you foresee happening here versus like in Western Europe and in Scandinavia and in those places, as far as the growth of that spectrum space goes and what we're going to do?
Yeah, very good question. I think the issue we have is that we are behind. Oh, the question was, what do you expect to see happen in terms of bandwidth and spectrum and the opportunity to do something here in the United States versus in Europe and other parts of the world? So what we have is very little licensed spectrum in the US, and most of that is, so everybody here in the room probably uses either Verizon or AT&T, right? Through a show of hands, how many use either Verizon or AT&T? So this is the most hands I've seen. This is 100% of this room. So would you agree with me that we have a duopoly in this country for access, carrier-level mobile access? Yes. So that's fine if it's just phone service, and maybe the phone companies need, I mean, their argument is, yes, we need the money, we need to charge, sort of like the public utilities need to be in business and the state sets the prices. They need to be someone that provides that level of service. That's great. However, there is an opportunity to also have a very open marketplace for bandwidth so that anybody, because the next young company, let's say any of you in this room wants to develop a little application, a phone-based application that you want to be instantly pervasive across lots of devices. The problem today is you're limited to being on either AT&T or Verizon. You don't have the opportunity to be able to go and just put it out there and anybody can use it. You have to go through a carrier, and the carrier charges you a price of access which may kill you as a young company. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is there's simply not enough bandwidth. And so there's this whole bandwidth area between, so Verizon and AT&T occupy the bandwidth north of 700 up to 950, 980. There's a bandwidth between 300 and 700, which is also low power, so you need fewer cell sites, lots of coverage, so good bandwidth with, so you don't have to put up as many cell sites and build a nice high bandwidth network. That doesn't exist as an opportunity because of the fact that the government has not yet delicensed it. So what I'm proposing is not that the government actually end up auctioning it, because if they auction it, again, only the big players can afford it because it'll go for billions of dollars. Essentially make it completely unlicensed so anybody can build products for that segment, and you will unleash a whole new wave of innovation. There'll be lots of little devices with smarts on it, and people will actually be able to use them because there'll be enough bandwidth. So this may or may not happen. I think the FCC chairman himself is in favor of it. He has exactly only another month left in office. Then you have the lobby of the cell phone providers. AT&T has 70 people calling on the FCC every day. I'm just one person. And Verizon has an equal number of people. And then you have the Broadcasters Association, who have their own issues and so forth. So it may or may not happen, but it's unfortunate because the rest of the world is ahead of the US, especially Japan, Korea, and parts of Western Europe.
Let's do one last question.
Over there?
You mentioned some of the organizations, universities, etc., moving to the cloud, relying on companies like Google to do calendar, productivity, etc. What if you have what we had a couple weeks ago, we have a service outage, and those could be absolutely crippling, these organizations that come to solely rely on these cloud computing applications? What do you think are the...
Yeah, very good question. I think we're still in the early days of that, but they have to make it 100% or 99.9% reliable. Of course, you could have an outage on your own desktop where it could have a senior moment and just crash on you. But the fact is, if it happens on a network that's serving literally tens of thousands of users, that's a big problem. And that has been an issue on both Amazon and on Google, and they're in the early days of figuring all this out. But today it is running probably, I'd say, 600,000-700,000 people or more who are continuously using it for those apps. The number of people obviously on Gmail and all the other apps that go with calendar and sync and so forth are much, much, much larger. That's in the tens of millions. But just on those apps, they're in the sort of sub 10 million range today. And that's, the early results are very, very promising. But the outages haven't been long. There have been a few that have been long, but they need to learn. I mean, it has to be 100% reliable and redundant with backup and everything, just like you expect. And the other thing they need to do is, of course, policy, where they need to let the user decide what data they want to keep, what data they don't want to keep. And there's going to be new case law in terms of legal pulls and pressures, where if the government subpoenas a company to say, turn over this individual's data, would you do it? Would you do it just if they asked? But this is the issue in China. So you're crossing new boundaries in terms of censorship, in terms of what data will you turn over under legal law, under current case law, and so forth. So Google, for example, decided not to host any user-generated parts of their business in China because of the laws. So they'll basically be turning people in. If under the local laws, you have to do that. Here in the US, I think our issues are slightly different, which is, at what point is it a national security thing? Because it is a trust issue with the user. And it may not be something on the application side. It may be even related to, say, searches, anything else. So we're going to have the movement of law to catch up with the internet as well. Good. Well, thank you
Great.
all, and good luck to all of you.